Welcome to the channel. I have with me what I think is one of the most interesting and unique modern camo patterns available. This is the Swedish M90 pattern. Now the Swedish M90 pattern is a splinter pattern, which means it's got large geometric shapes in various shades of green. It's got no dappling effects and it's got no blended effects, so the shades that you see are distinct and separate of each other, but they are very, very strongly contrasting. So for instance, this green, which is not the darkest shade, is positioned literally next to the lightest shades of green. And the idea behind that is that at distance or on large surfaces, a shape, say a human shape, will be very effectively camouflaged and disrupted. In fact, the Swedish M90 pattern was an evolution from a camo pattern that was being used on Swedish military aircraft in the 1970s. So the whole concept of disguising large shapes was very central to the thinking behind the Swedish M90 Camo. Sweden decided to revamp its military uniforms. It ran a conscript army, and up until then they were using standard green uniforms. They took the aircraft camouflage, scaled it down to human size, and applied it to the uniform. And they started rolling this out between the mid-80s and the mid-90s when they completed the rollout, hence the M90 designation. Because Sweden ran a conscript military, the focus was not so much on close-quarter assault warfare, but far more on defensive postures. And so the thinking behind the Swedish M90 pattern was that it would be a good and effective pattern at about 1 kilometer range. The thinking behind it must have been that if you have a mainly conscript army, then you're going to want to keep them largely at some distance in order to keep them relatively safe. If you're going to be sending people in less than 1 kilometer, then the chances of injury or death are just that much higher, and probably unacceptable when you're dealing with conscripts. Swedish M90 camo is generally very hard to get hold of, and it was all the way up until fairly recently. Sweden actually still had its conscript army until about 2010, at which stage it decided to go to a volunteer army, with the perception of threat having been lowered quite significantly at that stage. Sweden ran a volunteer army between 2010 and 2017, but by 2017 they were so much more worried about the threat of aggression, particularly from Russia, that they decided the volunteer army was probably not sufficient to keep Sweden defended. And so they moved back to having a conscript army, but this time both men and women were subject or liable to military service. Sweden has actually gone one further with regard to the Swedish M90 pattern, or they've actually gone and copyrighted it in 2020. So a large industry of people making aftermarket Swedish M90 camo jackets, gear, that's probably going to come to an end. The sizes we tend to see coming out from surplus reflect 2010 male conscription mainly, of 18 and 19-year-olds, and so the typical sizes that you will tend to get are, for example, heights between 175 and 185 centimeters, or about 5'8" to 5'11", thereabouts, matched with chest sizes of about 41 inches, matched with waist sizes of about 32 inches. If you're a little bit taller, let's say over 6 foot, 185 to 195 centimeters, then that tends to be matched most commonly with shirts which are about 44 to 45 inches on the chest, and trousers which are about 35 inches on the waist. Again, fairly typical sizes for young men of about 18 to 19 years old entering a conscript military. That takes me to the sizing conventions that are to be found on the Swedish uniforms. Now, Sweden wasn't a NATO country leading up to 2010, and so they tend to do sizing in height, overall, a height range of 10 centimeters, and a weight range of 10 kilos. So you'll often find marked on the shirts and trousers a size that says 175 to 185, for example, in this one, and 80 to 90 kilos. And I suspect the thinking behind that is that if you have a conscript who's come in, the first thing that they've done is probably to have a medical. And of course, if you're going to have a medical, then they will have recorded your height and your weight. So it would speed up things just to have all the uniforms done by height and weight as well. Yeah, I suppose it means that if you're a little bit out of the average, then you will probably have to make do with a shirt that's a bit too big for you, and maybe trousers which are a little bit too small for you, possibly. But I suppose that's the price of being in a conscript military. The Swedish uniforms are not entirely complete because one of the conditions of sale as surplus back in the 2010s had been that all insignia had to be removed. So, for instance, there would normally be a contract tag or something like that in this area on the upper back, but that's been removed, and so there are only some stitch lines left. Equally, there would be some flag insignia and something else, maybe a unit insignia or something like that, sewn onto the upper arm as well on the left. And these have also been removed. The standard issue shirts are fairly no nonsense. Just a button front with no zips, 2 chest pockets, sleeves with no extra arm pockets, but with a button so that you can have your sleeves neatly rolled up, and a traditional collar. The stitching tends to be a very sturdy double felled chain stitch along all the seams actually, so that's another hallmark to show you that you definitely have a genuine article of surplus here. No shoulder epaulets, but you do get a rank tab on the front and some space for insignia, the insertion of various other awards, badges, whatever that would have gone in there. There's the trousers, which show the greatest design innovations for uniform for a conscript army. So the trousers themselves have a very strong taper, by which I mean the lower leg is very much tightly fitted around the actual leg itself. Much more so than in American trousers or British trousers, or even German ones. The idea is so that if you're having to fit gaiters over the top, or if you are walking through brush, then you don't have a lot of extra material to get snagged and caught. Features of the lower leg include an area of reinforcement just on the inside ankle, a long lower leg zip. They have slightly shaped knees with a reinforcement patch, but the leg pockets are very large with a zip opening, with this large chunky zip. I like this very much because it means that with less material you actually have greater security of the contents. The Swedish trousers don't have a seat pocket, but it is made up for by the fact they have these hip pockets with their own button flaps. And these are quite deep as well. The waist of the trousers has got a double button. So, in fact, there's a button on the inside of the waist as well as one on the outside. And then the ever traditional zip fly. All zips, as you can see, from the pocket zips, lower leg zips to the fly zip, are made of the same large plastic chunky zip construction. Even if they do get clogged with a bit of dirt and mud, they should be relatively easy to clean, being all plastic and quite large. The Swedish trousers do have belt loops all throughout, and they also have these additional loops that if you prefer to wear shoulder braces with them, then you can loop those in at the waist on 3 points as well. Again, the sizing on the trousers is done by overall height, and weight, with some washing instructions on the inside. The material of the trousers is quite well thought out, being a medium to heavy weight fabric which is specifically designed to be fairly smooth on the surface to reduce the amount of snagging that can occur on the fabric itself. The Swedish uniforms are actually very tightly woven, so the fabric itself has a kind of windproof property. It potentially means that if you are in a hot and humid climate, they might be a little bit moisture trapping as a result. The fit of the Swedish uniforms tends to be that the shirts are quite large and wide, and a little bit one size fits many, and the trousers are very tapered and quite tight. So if you enjoy collecting or having some unique camo patterns, getting some Swedish M90 is probably a nice one to add in. We're in one of those phases where there's a relative plentiful supply of it because of the 2010 decommissioning of so many uniforms at the same time. But I suspect that once they're all gone, they're never coming back. Even in areas which are partially brown and partially green, this is actually a pretty good pattern to have. There are lots of photos out there and discussions about this pattern in real use. So I hope you found this video interesting, and see you next time. Bye bye.